All right.
I get to pick one?
You get to pick one.
We get a new one.
Okay. Yeah, well, the reason we decided to do it this way is that people have been trying for 2024 years to talk about who Jesus Christ is. And so we knew that we can't cover all that territory in, say, 40 minutes. So this was just a quick and dirty way to do it.
So the question is, did he have brothers?
Okay, go for it. Did he?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to open it. Okay. All right, next question.
No, what I say is he had kin. Some of the language is unclear as to how they related to one another, but yes, I mean that's the short of it. There could be a theological thing that you want to tackle.
No.
Just a follow-up. Were they ever named?
Yes, some of his family was named.
Okay.
Yeah, so there were some named folks. But that's a good question.
Jesus' little brother, Jesus' little sister. Yeah, they had names.
Okay.
Did Jesus accept the title Christ? Ooh, that's a good one. That's a good one. Did Jesus accept the title Christ?
I thought you were going to take this one.
He's just too darn quick for me, you know? Yes and no. I mean, there are times where he talks about the Messiah or the Christ is going to have to be crucified, etc., and then rise again on the third day. But I think, like Brandon talked about in the sermon this morning, he resisted a lot of those titles. You see more of the titles in the Gospel of John. You know, I am the way, the truth, the light. I am the bread of life. No one comes to the Father except by me, etc., etc. The other Gospels don't have it quite to the same degree. John has a different agenda. And, yeah, so yes and no. He accepted the title, depending on which Gospel you're reading. Is that good enough?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes, I won't go any further than that.
Okay.
Oh, here's a longer question. What is the significance of Jesus' male gender to us today? Regards a more egalitarian vision. I want to go back to the
Reverend
first
Johnson?
question.
Yeah, I know. Did Jesus have brothers?
Should the male answer that question?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Because a woman wrote it, you better answer it. That's right. You might. While he's thinking about that, one piece of artwork you might want to see in the community room is by Charlie Carrillo, and it's a school bus. Yeah. You seen it? And Jesus is driving, and it's got the 12 disciples, but right behind Jesus is Mary Magdalene. According to Charlie Carrillo, telling Jesus where to go. I love this man.
Put that back in there.
Oh no, yeah. Okay.
What is the significance of Jesus' male gender? So you can go the social historical context in terms of who Jesus was and how he operated in that place in society, and the change he was able to affect. But when we talk about gender in Jesus, I also remind, it's controversial to refer to Paul. I recognize that. But Paul does write this really interesting phrase, there is no male nor female,
Right.
slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, that at some point theologically and Christologically, I think that we transcend or are called to transcend that kind of social historical gender assignment that Jesus encounters. That is a very meandering, maybe unclarified way of saying that yes, I affirm that Jesus was born a male in the agrarian world of Palestine in the first century. But his ministry, his reality, and even the presence of God inhabits that gender and others and then transcends them to create a vision of God's human family and kingdom that embraces all those manifestations.
Whoa.
What does that mean, Talitha?
That's right. I mean, it's a question. I mean, I remember friends of mine, especially college friends of mine, asking when I was going to seminary, how can you be a woman, how can you be a feminist and be a Christian? Why are you worshiping this white guy?
Yeah.
And there was one time several years later that I was wrestling with that too. And I went down to New York City, met up with Reuben Shears, Dr. Reuben Shears, one of the leaders of the United Church of Christ at that time. And I asked him, Reuben, how can you as an African American man worship this white guy? To which he first responded, daughter. He wasn't white. That was a big response. And he also said, and within my culture and within my life, referring to Jesus as king, like Ride On King Jesus, the Palm Sunday song, or Lord, Lord of all, that meant that Jim Crow and George Wallace and all of the stuff that was going on in his life as a young man growing up in Charleston, South Carolina, that meant that those people did not get the last word. And so that for him, in that context, Jesus as King, Jesus as Lord was really important. And granted, those are male words, but in that context, it was really important. And I would say the same thing was true for the early Christians, because there was no mindset that said women could be in power. I mean, in Judaism, it was you had the rabbis and the scribes, and yes, the women had the home ritual of the Sabbath, but they weren't priests, they weren't rabbis. And the same thing is true with the Roman Empire. I mean, you can name the male Roman emperors. Empresses?
Yeah.
And so when you're trying to create something new, to a certain degree, you got to go with what's available. And that doesn't mean that Jesus' gender in this time should be exclusive, but the fact that he did reach out and welcome in, I mean, he honored Mary of Magdala, relied on her, he defended women all the time in terms of their being excluded. When Martha wanted her sister Mary to come into the kitchen and do the women's duties, he defended Mary for wanting to sit and learn. That was a male rabbinical kind of thing to do. So there's always, at least the way I've understood it is, or understood it for myself in order to be a Christian minister, is there's always a counter voice running through it, running through the Gospels. And even weirdo Paul, when you read Paul, there's times you've got to, one has to decide, is this really Paul or was this added on later? Because Paul relied on women. Lydia, who helped him found the Philippian church, the deacons, Priscilla and others. This new Christian faith would never have gotten off the ground had it not been for the women in the early church. So do we wrestle with it? Yeah, because it's an embodied thing. But, I mean, we live in a time where male and female roles, and I'm not talking just about transgender kinds of issues, but male and female roles around what's feminine and what's masculine, I think are getting pretty mixed up.
Yeah, to add to that, and I don't think Talitha and I, we've never talked about this, but when I was first called to United Church of Santa Fe, there was somebody at Yale Divinity School who said to me, you know how unusual that dynamic is, to have a female senior pastor and a young male associate.
Right.
And this was in 2008, even in the United Church of Christ. And fortunately, I think we've seen a shift. But to kind of model that balanced counter-narrative is really important. And so anyway, I wanted to add that.
Yeah, that is a partnership model rather than one up, one down kind of model. Which those of you who are in straight heterosexual relationships, I know or wrestle with as well in this culture that we're in. You know, it's a good question to have. Okay, that's enough on sex.
Or gender.
Or gender, okay. Oh my God, it's a question about sex. No. Now, I think they're talking, well, the question was about Jesus,
Yeah.
but I think this one is talking about you.
how can we?
Well, I don't know if it's about you or not. Well, let's see. The answer to this question.
If we heard the question.
That's the question. The
I think
question
it's
is the one you
about Jesus.
answer. It's about Jesus. Okay, good.
Yeah.
You were sweating bullets. Okay. The question is, what is one question you have about Jesus Christ? And the question the person wrote was, how can we find and keep you among us? See, I thought that was referencing you. So it's how.
That is a good question.
It is a good question. Well, I know. He's got a job. He's got a life elsewhere. Okay. How can we find and keep you among us? The you being Jesus Christ. I just answered the one about gender.
But that finding Jesus language, I think comes from some traditions that have been unhelpful, that somehow you have to do something or pray something or believe something the right way in order to find that which is Jesus. And my theological understanding, and certainly one that I was raised with, is the living Christ, the living Jesus is all around us. Mm-hmm. That we simply must not find but point to. And I can talk about the ministry of United. I can talk about the mountain range out here that reminds me of the beauty of God's creation, which to me is Jesus. And then keep among us. This is shooting from the hip. Is that practicing the acts that Jesus taught us keeps that living presence among us. You know, I think about the slogan of United Church of Santa Fe, love God, love neighbor, love creation. That keeps Jesus among us. And not that we have to get it perfect, not that it has to look right or always behave right, but if we adhere to that kind of ethics, that keeps the living, mysterious Jesus, Christ, whatever you call that figure among us. So that's how I would respond to that. The fine thing is, when I grew up in the Midwest, I often heard people ask me, when did you find Jesus? And they often wanted a specific time, circumstance, like I lifted up my pillow and suddenly there was Jesus.
Here's a rock.
Like, whoa, I've been looking for you my whole life.
That's right.
And then so that I step away from that language and rather talk to point to. And the more I look, the more I find that presence everywhere.
Yeah, the same thing. I grew up in Arizona during the time of the Jesus movement, and people when I was in middle school, high school, people had bumper stickers that said, "I found it." Mm-hmm. And I never knew what the it was. Well, I sort of knew what the it was, and I knew that I hadn't found it. At least I hadn't found it in the form the formulaic kind of form. And that was a wrestling for me. I mean, even when I went to seminary, having classmates who, being in an argument with one of my classmates early on about who is this, I don't know who this Jesus Christ is, and I don't know what it means to be, quote, saved. And I had all the whole list of questions, and to which the classmate responded, well, then maybe you don't belong in seminary. Whoa.
Thanks.
Yeah, but and I was feisty enough.
But
that I
you
said,
persevered.
Well, yeah. Well, I persevered or persisted or did something and whatever. But then my last year in seminary, I took a course. This is going to sound odd. Took a course, full-year course in the Divine Comedy, where some of you may have read the Inferno of the Divine Comedy, where you finally get out of hell. That's as much as I'd done, was to get out of hell. But then we actually went on up through paradise. And what I realized in Dante is that as he's going up through paradise, there is more and more sense of community. He has more and more ways of describing what paradise, what the experience. For him, it wasn't even Jesus Christ. It was Beatrice. And it was the singing, and it was the roses, and it was the way in which creation is described, and all of that. That I finally dawned on me that for me, Christ, how do I find Jesus Christ? I then began to think, okay, I've never known Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior. But I certainly have known experiences, communities, classes, whatever, that have given me new life. That have given me new life. And for me, that is a Christ event. So I invite you to think, whoever asked that question, and the rest of you, to think about what are the experiences you've had of new life. And maybe they were grand and glorious, or maybe they were, some inspiring high school teacher, or some friend, or some colleague. When you were at the end of your rope or energy or whatever, and somebody opened up a new door or a new way of thinking about the world and yourself or anything else. And so for me, that's, how do we find Jesus Christ and keep Christ? I guess I would start with looking back over one's life and thinking about how have I already experienced Christ? Christ is the one who gives new life, whatever form that comes in. Moving along. Good question, though.
Hope that nobody wrote anything on that. Oh, what happened in his missing years of his early years?
We don't know. Nobody knows.
This is my musical thing. Not nearly the level that United does, but the John Prine, a bluegrass artist, wrote a song and sang a song, Jesus and His Missing Years.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a kind of humorous, but also thoughtful take on how Jesus might have evolved as a human being. What he learned, what challenges he faced, what the world did to him, without that kind of thing. But the truth is we don't know. But what I can assume is that Mary probably got endlessly frustrated with him as a teenager.
But he was a human being.
He was a human being. And that a community shaped him. The truth is a community in those hills of Galilee, that he didn't just come out of a vacuum. But most scholars would say, yeah, that there were things that happened that were significant in those years. We just don't know.
We don't know. And the earliest gospel doesn't really care. Mark's gospel doesn't begin with birth narratives and all that kind of stuff. It begins with Jesus going to, John the Baptist coming out of the wilderness, Jesus going to the river to be baptized as a 30-some-odd-year-old adult, and then you're off to the races. It's only it's only Matthew and Luke that try to fill in the gaps, and then some of the apocryphal gospels. And then John begins out in the cosmos somewhere. So the early church wasn't really concerned about Jesus' upbringing, other than the fact that I agree with you completely. I mean, he was shaped by being part of a community of faith in those hills of Galilee. Mm-hmm. And he probably, read the same Psalms or heard the same Psalms that we use, the Psalms, the 150 of them. He probably had heard about the prophets. But did he go to India? Well, we don't know that. I mean, and how much does that matter? How much does that matter? That's a question for you. Okay. All right. I'll choose one. Okay. I feel like Vanna White. I don't look like Vanna White, but I feel like Vanna White. What is one question you have about Jesus Christ? Did he really say that he is God? Okay. I'm sorry. I was telling Brandon on that last hymn because that my arms weren't long enough, and I forgot. Did he really say that he is God more so than the rest of us are? Okay. Did he really say that he is God, parentheses, more so than the rest of us are? No. That makes a couple assumptions that we're God. But take it away, Reverend.
I answered the first last time.
Okay. Did he really say that he was God? Yes and no. Depends on which gospel you're reading. I mean, in John, definitely. But I don't think he said, I'm God because I'm so holy and righteous and kingly and all of that. I think in John's gospel, it's, if you want to know about God's hesed, steadfast love, this is the incarnation of it. The one who feeds, the one who rejects kingly power, the one who says, do not be afraid, and the one who gives his or her life for others. If you want to see God's steadfast love incarnate, then John is saying, look at this guy. Not because of his gender, any more than, not because of the fact that he was a Galilean or the fact that he was short, which he probably was. But look at what he does and what he embodies. If you want to see God's steadfast love, look at Jesus, what he did. And that can be the doing can be incarnate in anybody's body.
The only thing I would add, is probably going to say, he's going back to that anti-empire thing all the time.
No, it's important in this
Is
day.
that- and I agree with what Talitha said. The dwelling among us and the Gospels are a bit all over the place in terms of what Jesus did. And historically, there's questions about that. But what I will say is the title of God in the first century was also assigned to the emperor.
Absolutely.
That there was an
Yep.
imperial understanding that the emperor embodied God and had that power. And so some of the thrusting of that title on Jesus was to counter the notion that Caesar was God. No. That ultimately among the disciples in the early Jesus movement, that didn't have the last word. But Jesus, Yahweh did. That's probably me. Anyway, so when we talk about that title of God and whether Jesus understood that to be part of his identity, I think it's also important to ask what political ramifications in the first century did that title have? And that, to say this Palestinian peasant from the hills of Galilee was God, not Caesar, was revolutionary.
Mm-hmm.
To place that embodiment there and dislocate it from the empire was significant. And I think that's significant for our time as well, and how we understand power and who's important in our world.
Yeah, the whole thing of the render unto Caesar what is the coin, whose face is on it? Caesar's face was on it because Caesar's face was on everything. But then Jesus says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. Well, that means Caesar is not God.
Yeah. Who's next? I take that tough one.
I think
Oh,
so.
wasn't that maybe?
This is a good one. Did he speak Spanish? I think I know where that one came from.
Well, you speak better Spanish than I do.
He spoke Aramaic. He spoke Aramaic, a dialect of Hebrew. He may have known, sort of high religion Hebrew, but we don't know that for sure. I mean, he apparently was able to read the Torah, which wouldn't have been written in Aramaic. It might have been written in Hebrew, or it might have been written in Greek, because that was the lingua franca at the time. But he spoke Hebrew. I mean, he spoke Aramaic, as in Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Why, my God, why have you forsaken me? So yeah, he spoke the language from which he came,
And was proud of that language.
and was proud of that language.
And why I think it's important, what United did today in terms of the service, that our faith comes in multiple languages. English is the dominant thing, happened at one point in the United States, but to recognize that Jesus didn't speak
He didn't speak the King's English.
and it didn't pop out of his mouth in red letters.
That's right.
Aramaic was very much his world. And so then I think, what we're called to do is to recognize that faith comes in multiple languages.
That's right. That's right.
And that's a good thing.
Thank you, Chiefs.
Got to dig deeper in this. Was he married?
Why would it be important? Why would it be important whether or not he was married? I mean, quite possibly, he probably wasn't, because he was an itinerant preacher. And they don't get paid a lot for one thing. And they don't settle down, all of those kinds of things. And my hunch is that then sort of goes into the issue of whether or not priests or other people should be celibate or whatever. My hunch is that at least that's sort of an under question of, was he married? The best answer I ever heard to all of that was from Hans Kuhn, who was a German theologian in the 1960s and 70s, and on into the 80s until Benedict excommunicated him, the first part of this century. Hans Kuhn, who was Roman Catholic, born and bred and German, etc. And he was speaking one time at the Divinity School, and one of the questions that came up was his understanding of the requirement that Catholic priests had to be single and celibate. And he gave a very interesting answer to it, that he thought, number one, that wasn't the case in the first 300 years of the Christian church, because there's one of the pastoral letters that says bishops should not have more than one wife. Well, as a professor of New Testament Christian scripture, I can't remember which one it was, said one time in a class, if there's a question like that being asked, you know it's a problem. That they had more than one wife. And so, and it doesn't say they should, the text doesn't say they shouldn't be married. It says they should only have one wife. Okay? So that's one thing. That it wasn't really until Constantine and all of that the whole celibacy thing kicked in. And really until the Middle Ages. And some of it in the Middle Ages was very practical. You didn't want priests or abbots or others having lots of kids, because then you were going to have to divide up the church's property. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why the celibacy thing came into being. But Kuhn also talked about temporary celibacy. And what he talked about was, and this was in the time of Daniel and Philip Berrigan, the two Catholic priests, one of whom went to jail for their anti-war work, anti-nuclear work. And he said that Philip, they'd both been priests, Philip then got married later to a nun, but Daniel was the one who kept going to jail. And what his understanding was of temporary celibacy, if you're going to sign up in ministry, whether it's ordained or lay or whatever, for hardship duty, you might want to consider making a covenant of celibacy. Because because you've got responsibilities other than that hardship duty. You've got spouse, kids, as Zorba the Greek said, the full catastrophe. and your covenant with them is also of God and very important. I thought that was, and so why couldn't the Catholic Church, if they want celibacy, or even other Protestant churches, if they want celibacy, do it on a temporary basis? I'm going to go to Iraq and work in refugee camps for 5 years. It would probably be a good thing if I weren't married in doing that, because I'm not keeping the covenant with the people that I've left behind. So I think that, was Jesus married? What difference does it make? Well, I think it freed him up to do what he chose to do, going up against the Roman emperor. I'm not sure I would have wanted to be married to Jesus, knowing what he was doing. Nor would I want to be Jesus and have responsibilities for others, knowing what I felt called to do, to stand up to the Roman emperor. Right?
I think that covers it. But yeah, we don't know. I mean,
We just don't know. But I do think when people ask you that or get off on it, just say, what difference does it make? And if they talk about celibacy, tell them about temporary celibacy. And then ask when they're going to sign up for the Peace Corps. Okay. I don't know where we are in terms of,
Noon. We're at noon.
Okay, a couple more questions. Okay, good. Can Reverend Johnson, can the resurrection of Jesus also be viewed as a metaphor similar to walking on water? They actually listened.
You're going to talk to the folks in Burbank.
I know. Thank you.
My short answer to that is yes, definitely, and importantly. And I remember when I was first wrestling with this question of resurrection and what it meant. I was reading Marcus Borg at the time, who's a scholar now gone, work lives on. But he talked about going to different churches, literalists, progressives, mainline, middle-of-the-road Protestants, and he said we all talked about resurrection in the same way, that all of us turned it into metaphor on Easter, regardless of where you land on that spectrum. Because even for the most conservative churches, they talked about resurrection as being born in new life, redeemed, that they didn't often get into the weeds of that. So I would say, yes, it is metaphor, and we should practice talking about resurrection metaphor. And one of the things that I often remember about United is every Easter, most Easters there would be some sort of gift or something to take away that represented resurrection, a metaphor for that moved into our lives. And so I think, and resurrection occurs in all four Gospels. It's very different in Mark than it is the other three, but they are all inconsistent. They don't have the same people there. Different things happen in each scene, and depending on who's at the tomb, when and where. Did they go away terrified, or did Mary run back to the disciples trying to convince them of what happened? And so I think the way they write it is a way that allows us to step in and create it in a way that makes sense to us in terms of new life, redemption. So yeah, anyway, that's my long way of saying, yes, resurrection is metaphor. And it's a powerful, powerful metaphor. I would get into empire again, but I'm not.
Well, I mean, in a way that leads in my New Testament Christian Scripture class at Yale. Luke Timothy Johnson, who was on the faculty there and then went to Emory, former Franciscan priest who met someone and got married and then became a full-time professor of New Testament Christian Scripture. And I remember when we got to the resurrection stories at the end of the Gospels, and he said exactly much the same that Brandon said. They don't agree. They don't agree. But he said the important thing is that something happened, and that something happened not just in Jesus Christ's life, but in the lives of those people who are trying to follow. Simon Peter the denier became Simon Peter the preacher. Mary Magdalene stood before the Emperor Tiberius, at least according to legend, and proclaimed the resurrection. They found their voices, they found their ability to witness, they found the courage, in many instances, to face down death. So something happened in the resurrection, not just to Jesus, but to anyone who either experienced it or heard about it and believed what was possible. So it puts the responsibility for resurrection back on us. I don't know. Thanks. What was it? Okay. So I'm just going to run my glasses.
What was it like to part?
I think let's just go to another question. I can't figure out.
Yeah. Okay. We'll ask that.
Yeah. Jesus could have read it, but we can't.
Did Jesus have trouble choosing his 12 disciples?
That's a good question. I don't think he had trouble choosing them. I think he had trouble after he'd chosen them. He was like, come on in, you guys. Yeah, let's do this thing. And then, oh my God, oy vey, what did I just do? Yeah. I mean, it doesn't say that. I mean, it makes it at least we don't really know that much about the choosing of the disciples, other than the two accounts. One of the fishermen leaving their fishing nets, the four of them, and following him, no questions asked. There's nothing in the gospel about how their father felt about them doing that, how their wives, their sisters, the other people that depended on them. But they just did it and they followed. And then there's Matthew's story of Matthew the tax collector getting up. Jesus says, come follow me. And then it just lists out the other names.
Yeah, I think, yeah, the biggest challenge was after he chose them
Yeah.
and organizing them. But I
They don't
do,
tell you that in seminary, though, you know.
but I ought, and it's not in the text. I think it's Serene Jones that talks about scriptural imagination, that sometimes we're left to our imagination. And what I like to imagine is how many people said no, or said, this isn't for me. If you think about the revolutionary nature of what Jesus was doing, I imagine there were people in that world that said, I respect what you're doing, I might even agree with it, but it's too much, too soon. And so part of my scriptural imagination likes to imagine what were those conversations like?
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
the story of the rich young man who comes to Jesus and says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And yes, I know the commandments, love God, love neighbor. And then Jesus says, sell all your goods, come follow me. And the guy says, sayonara, I'm out of here. And Jesus doesn't chase after him.
Yeah.
The other thing, in some ways, I would say this also gets back to the whole male, female, did Jesus have to be male, et cetera, et cetera. The chosen disciples all were men. I mean, they all had guys' names, Nathaniel and James and John, et cetera, et cetera. But again, if you read the counter stream that goes through that text, is that there were a heck of a lot of women who followed as well. Some of whose names we know: Mary of Magdala, Mary, mother of James, Mary, whatever, and then others whose names we don't know. And again, that's indicative of when these Gospels were written. If you're going to start a movement, and also, I mean, it was a pretty radical thing for those women to be part of the people who followed, because think of the time. You didn't have groups of women roaming the countryside, whether they were following a woman or a man, by themselves without a man to protect them. That's pretty darn radical if you look at what's going on in Christian scripture when it comes to women's roles. But they also, I mean, they were people who wrote the Gospels, Paul, they were products of their times. I think they pushed the envelope pretty far, but I don't think I can be too smug 2,000 years later and say, well, why didn't they do it like my generation is doing it? Because I know I'm old enough that there are generations below me of women saying, well, why didn't you guys push it farther? Okay, why don't you get the last question, then we'll let you guys go. You've been wonderful. I hope this has been helpful. Sort of a streamlined way of doing it.
Well, that's a repeat of one before. I swear it's a repeat.
Did you just speak Aramaic? Is that the question?
No.
Okay.
It was about resurrection.
Okay.
How did you know you were the Son of God? About Jesus.
About Jesus, okay.
Oh, there's a hand waving in the back.
No, that's okay. Oh, who's saying?
My question was, what was it like being part human?
Oh, what is it like being part human? Okay, thank you, Albert, thank you. Okay, let's go with that question.
Okay.
Go for it.
How was it to be part human? Messy.
That's right.
Difficult. You think about we all know the things we struggle with on a daily basis. And I think that's the beauty of that language around Jesus' humanity, is he struggled, he was challenged, he had disappointment, friends left him, abandoned him. I think it's wonderfully beautiful to talk about Jesus' humanity, but that's a good question. Would Jesus say that was beautiful?
Yeah.
I hope so. But I would imagine when he was in the midst of life and feeling alone and doubting that it was not always easy. And I think that when we enter the fullness of that story and recognize who he is, I think we can begin to see our own story play out as well. Doubts, disappointments, abandonment, all those things that we can put on our list. But it's a good question. It's something we need to be reminded of.
Absolutely. And he was part of being human, for him, as for us, was part of being part of a larger community, whether it was a faith community or a family or co-workers, if one considers the disciples co-workers. And things aren't always hunky-dory. I mean, so you have a lot of tension. His mother and brothers show up and he says, those who do the will of God are my mother and brothers. if I'd been Jesus' mother at that moment, I would have been hard pressed to be nonviolent. Or, the fact that he gets hungry and zaps a fig tree because it's not producing figs in the time when figs weren't to be produced. I mean, he got cranky. He got angry because he was a human being. He got pretty ticked off at Peter at times. So, yeah. Which, for me at least, says that do not be afraid. When we get tired, angry, upset, disappointed, betrayed, denied, and think that nothing we've done is worth the price of a penny. All right, well, thank you very much. Thanks for being such a good congregation.